Topic 2.3, and in this topic we're looking at exchange rates. Once again, we've got an entire topic devoted to exchange rates, so we're just trying to understand what the main drivers of exchange rates are at a very fundamental level here. So really just another macroeconomic fundamental that we need to wrap our head around, that we need to understand before we move on. So what we've got here is the market for foreign exchange. So it's the Forex market. Very often it's abbreviated to Forex. And we've got the market for Australian dollars. So I've got the demand curve of the Australian dollar and the supply curve. It's a competitive market. These foreign exchange markets are competitive markets. And very similar to interest rates in the last topic, the last subtopic, the participants in these foreign exchange markets are big players. So what I mean by big players, I mean governments, banks, other financial institutions, big corporations. So these are big markets where big amounts of money get traded. So for example, if I want to participate in sort of the foreign exchange market, I do so by going into the bank in a sense. It's not really participating in this market, but if I want foreign exchange, US dollars, I go into my bank. They will swap me some of my Australian dollars for some US dollars. I then go to New York on holiday and have a great time. But I'm not really directly participating in this market that I've got this demand and supply curve set up for. It's my bank that has already done that to acquire the US dollars that they then sell on to me. So whenever you see this diagram, and you will see this diagram in the remainder of the course, you've got to realize that it's not individuals like you and me participating in this market directly. We'll indirectly participate in it through our financial institution, but it's the big players that participate in this market. So we've got a demand for the Australian dollar, demand curve for the Australian dollar, and a supply curve. Let's just have a look at this exchange rate first. So 0.75 cents. Over here, what this means is that 1 Australian dollar can be exchanged for 0.75 US cents. So the obvious question is, well, who creates a demand for the Australian dollar in the Forex market? By creating a demand, what you're doing is you're demanding, you want to buy Australian dollars using foreign exchange. You're then creating a demand. I don't know about you, but I don't create a demand as an Australian. I don't create a demand for the Australian dollar. I don't have large amounts of foreign currency that I want to use to buy Australian dollars. So generally speaking, we're going to look at the demand curve and assume that that demand curve is determined by the position of it and the slope of it is determined by foreigners who have foreign currency and they want to use that foreign currency to demand or buy the Australian dollar. Of course, there are little exceptions to that. So for example, when BHP or Rio Tinto sell iron ore, they will be paid in US dollars. So in that case, when those companies take their revenue in US dollars from selling iron ore and move it back into Australia, they will be creating a demand for the Australian dollar. And so any Australian company or organisation that earns foreign currency will also be demanding Australian dollars. But let's keep it nice and simple for now. Remember that and appreciate that. But just for now, we'll assume that most of the demand curve, or most of the demand for the Australian dollar is generated by foreigners wishing to buy Australian dollars, presumably because they want to buy something Australian. And by something Australian, I mean a good, a service, or an asset of some sort. Asset could be real estate, a foreigner buying an Australian home, a foreigner buying an Australian share, or an Australian bond. We'll learn about bonds a little bit later in the course. So the demand curve is generated by foreigners wishing to buy Australian dollars so they can buy something Australian, an Australian good or service or asset. Now, obviously, the demand curve slopes downwards. That makes perfect sense because As the Aussie dollar gets cheaper, foreigners want to buy more of it because it means whatever they want to buy with those Australian dollars is also cheaper. If you can buy the Australian dollar at a lower rate, then obviously Australian goods and services are going to be cheaper for you. So let's figure this out. If the exchange rate falls from 0.75, which is the equilibrium price in this diagram, or the equilibrium rate in this diagram, if it falls from that down to say 0.5, then over here, it means that now, rather than having to spend 0.75 of one US dollar to buy one Australian dollar, if this is 0.5, this exchange rate, through maybe a rightward shift in the supply curve, that means it only takes 0.5 of one US dollar to buy one Australian dollar. So as the exchange rate drops, we move along the demand curve because the Australian dollar is cheaper for foreigners to buy. Therefore, Australian university education is cheaper, Australian tourism is cheaper, everything, Australian bonds and shares and real estate, all cheaper. So that justifies why the demand curve slopes downwards. As the Australian dollar becomes cheaper for foreigners to buy, that is, as the Australian dollar depreciates, foreigners demand more of it. Then the question is, well, who creates the supply of the Australian dollar? Well, presumably the people who are holding Australian dollars who wish to exchange them for some foreign currency. You've got to realise that in this foreign exchange market, what is being bought and sold are currencies. People are exchanging one currency for another. So coming back to the supply curve, who holds Australian dollars? Who can supply them? Keep it nice and simple. We're going to assume that it's Australians who supply Australian dollars. So for example, if you're planning on going to somewhere in Asia for a holiday soon, then you will need to buy foreign currencies to do so. And you'll need to buy those foreign currencies using Australian dollars. And as you undertake that transaction of using Australian dollars to buy a foreign currency, yes, you're creating demand for those foreign currencies, but you're simultaneously supplying the Australian dollar. Think about that. You're going on holiday to somewhere in Asia, you need to buy some Asian currency. When you undertake that transaction, you're actually supplying Australian dollars into the market. And you're supplying Australian dollars when you're paying for those foreign Asian currencies that you wish to purchase. So as a buyer of a foreign currency, you're simultaneously in the same transaction, a supplier of the Australian dollar. And so therefore, as the Australian dollar appreciates, what that means is foreign currencies become cheaper for you to buy. You might have to convince yourself of that. Take a minute and convince yourself. But as the Australian dollar appreciates, as we move up this vertical axis, that means the Australian dollar is becoming more valuable relative to foreign currencies. The Australian dollar, as we move up this axis vertically, the Australian dollar can buy more foreign currency per 1 unit of Australian dollar. And so therefore, foreign currencies become cheaper as the Aussie dollar appreciates, foreign goods and services become cheaper. So as an Australian, you'll supply more. Now I'm saying you, I'm talking about an individual. What's actually going to be happening here is as the Australian dollar appreciates, it'll be those big players in foreign exchange markets that actually supply more. And you'll be part of that through your bank. But it'll be the bank intervening and not intervening, it'll be the bank participating in this market on your behalf that will create a supply, an additional supply of the Australian dollar whenever you want some foreign currency. Okay, so the demand curve determined by people wanting to buy the Australian dollar, typically foreigners, but not always. As I mentioned, Rio, BHP earn revenue and are paid in US dollars for iron ore. And then you've got the supply curve of the Australian dollar. That's people who are supplying the Australian dollar to actually exchange it for foreign currency. This market is highly competitive. On any given day, there are going to be hundreds of buyers and hundreds of sellers of the Australian dollar. And its movements in the exchange rate, which receive a lot of attention in the press. So any rightward shift in the demand for the Australian dollar appreciates. Think of the exchange rate as the price of the Australian dollar. So if there's an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar, its price goes up, just like the demand and supply in any market. If you've got the demand and supply curve for oranges and there's an increase in the demand for oranges, the price of oranges go up. So if there is an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar, the price of the Australian dollar goes up. And so it'll go up from 0.75 maybe to 0.9. So how is that, how do you think, what's the best way to think about that appreciation? So an appreciation is just the term we use for an increase in an exchange rate. How do you think about that appreciation from 0.75 up to say 0.9 as an increase in the price of the Australian dollar? It's quite easy. If we come back to this, prior to the rightward shift in the demand curve, the Australian dollar could be purchased for 75 US cents. But now with the increase in demand, the exchange rate's gone to 0.9, which now means it takes 90 US cents to buy one Australian dollar. So obviously the Australian dollar, in terms of US dollars, has become more expensive to buy. Okay, so sometimes it's very convenient to think about the exchange rate as a price, the price of one currency expressed in terms of another. In this case, it's the price of the Australian dollar expressed in terms of US dollars. And when the demand curve shifts to the right, the price of the Australian dollar increases, that is, it appreciates. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Once again, we will get into this whole idea of exchange rates in much more detail. We'll be looking at the euro currency and why that has created problems for the countries in the southern part of Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, those countries. And then we'll be looking at the Chinese currency as well, which is a highly managed exchange rate. We'll probably look at Singapore and Hong Kong as well. So we'll look at a range of different exchange rate systems. Of course, we will be looking at the Australian dollar as well and what drives the value of the Australian dollar up and down.